I'm going to talk about intersectionality and entrepreneurship, and the ways in which I critique entrepreneurship are as the master's tools, because in many ways it's used as an economic development policy to foster inclusive economic development. So I'm going to be looking at entrepreneurship as that thing that I critique through this lens of intersectionality, because in many ways it's sort of touted as that tool to help economic development be fostered in an inclusive fashion, when in reality it is anything but. So I'm going to start with, if you're familiar with me, my research is generally fostered around feminisms of the post-colonial and transnational sort, and today I arrive at it from an intersectionality perspective. I'm going to apply it to entrepreneurship, and then I suppose at the end we'll do Q&A when we're supposed to sitting down. For those of you familiar with feminisms, great, but there are many varieties and streams associated with feminisms, and the ways in which I sort of deploy them here are arriving from an intersectionality perspective. So in that sense, I'm trying to center the experiences, particularly of women of color, in the book that I co-wrote with Susan Clark-Montine around the experiences of women entrepreneurs in Boston who are trying to succeed but finding it extremely difficult. So the talk today will focus on some of those aspirations and challenges that they're facing despite the liberal claims in a city that say they value and espouse diversity and inclusion, but the outcomes look quite different. Some of the writing that I do for this book comes from academic frameworks, but what we discover in doing the research is that the lived experiences of women and those who identify as female often don't fit neatly into categories. So in the book, we try to dispel some of the myths that all of the experiences arriving from a particular social category are the same, when in reality there's nuances, complexities, and even, I would say, counterexamples of how people are trying to make it in a city that is not built for them or by them. The inspiration for the book comes from many different years of trying to understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts generally don't work well in the space of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ecosystems in general. And one of the inspirations for the book comes from the work of Cynthia Enloe, and if you're familiar with her, she has done some fantastic work in political economy from feminist perspectives, asking us to take on an approach that begs the question of how do we make feminist sense of the world around us. And she gives a great example of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown in Japan and asks the question, how would a gender or a feminist analysis rethink what happened? And many people would say, what are you talking about, Cynthia? There's no women in the power plant. And often, that's the reasoning you get when you ask someone about gender. But in reality, what was happening in the power plant was there was a certain form of toxic masculinity that created a hyper-competitive environment, and a lot of people decided that they were not going to follow the rules. So for me, a gender analysis, a feminist making sense, allows for us to see those interactions that are gendered and highly racialized in contexts where you may not think that they are. Another inspiration comes from the work of Tammy Navarro, where she asks about how do we create knowledge and create systems of change so that the writing that we do does not stay in the text but has implications for change. And that's really the inspiration for the book that we co-wrote, is that hopefully it will be an impetus for change, for people to change the narrative around how they think about inclusion within the space of entrepreneurship. When we talk about intersectionality, and I know many colleagues here have defined it in their own terms, I come at it from the ways in which the intersecting dimensions of gender and race need to be understood in relationship to the differential experiences of women of color, but in that sense, beyond a new identity category. A lot of times intersectionality is used as a way to talk about identities. In the book, we really tried to understand it as beyond that, to address the structural, the political, and the cultural elements that often lead to the particular experiences of marginalization, exclusion, but also empowerment for women of color. At the same time, there's some critique of intersectionality as in its limited ways in which it still exemplifies a neoliberal ideology in terms of asking people to see beyond differences. And there's sort of these four fundamental issues with it that Nash identifies, saying there's really a lack of clearly defined methodology that's associated with intersectionality. The prototypical sort of person that's centered is the Black woman, when there are other experiences and identities that might need to be considered. There's sort of this ambiguity that's inherent to the definition of intersectionality, and that there is sometimes an incoherence between how we define categories and the lived experiences of people. I bring all that to bear on entrepreneurship to say that often when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's centered on certain people and categories, when in fact people might not actually fit into those categories so neatly. One of the ways in which I tried to bring a DEI perspective to entrepreneurship is to interrogate what I call the historic and contemporary ways in which entrepreneurship unfolds, to make visible those gendered and racialized ways in which people engage in their everyday activities. The book that I am borrowing from today is based on about a 4 to 5 year old longitudinal study that focused on the experiences of different entrepreneurs in the Boston ecosystem. And if you're familiar with Boston, you know that it's an incredibly fragmented city. It is a city that has a historic landscape of racial tensions, and in many ways, it does espouse a lot of liberal values. So you might think that the ways in which the city acts and supports entrepreneurs of color or those from different backgrounds might be really good. But in fact, we find that Boston in many ways is actually much more segregated than other cities that might be known to you. So what I want to do is sort of break down the ways in which intersectionality helps us understand why the approaches to be inclusive in entrepreneurship and to include people who have been historically marginalized are simply not going to work. And in that way, what I want to do is sort of share with you the ways in which intersectionality allows us to see what's happening in ways that are different, that sort of challenge the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that tend to fall on either individuals or organizations when really the problems are quite systemic. So in that way, intersectionality as a framework allows us to see and consider how power is a relevant part of the institutional arrangements and the creation of an environment that tends to favor and reward, even if unintentionally, certain genders, races, and immigrant backgrounds over others. And it tends to exacerbate existing inequalities across social categories. So what I often find is that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't tend to talk about power as much. And so one of my approaches to talking about DEI within the context of entrepreneurship is to say that power is an important and missing dimension from any analysis that touts entrepreneurship as a way to create inclusive economic development. One of the things that we see in entrepreneurship is that the role and importance of networks in social capital is paramount to how people are able to navigate the resources of an entrepreneurial ecosystem in a city in general. And by using trusted networks and social relations as a proxy to reduce transaction costs, which is how venture capitalists operate, what they're essentially doing is trying to find a way to do due diligence and to give money to people that they trust. And in the research, what we find is despite espousing diversity, equity, and inclusion as important belief systems, who they end up funding and who they end up investing in are actually quite the opposite of the people that they claim to value. So what we find is that when people say trust, what they really want to say is around whiteness in the Boston ecosystem. And the other sort of expectation is that reducing transaction costs seems to be the only measure of economic success that is deemed as an appropriate approach for economic development, when in reality, we know that when you approach the social networks in a way that creates inequalities, it simply furthers existing inequalities rather than create new opportunities for individuals. So if we assume that everyone in an entrepreneurial ecosystem has the exact same opportunities, then we can say that the ways in which funding is taking place is merit-based, when in reality, what we actually see is that it's anything but meritocratic. In fact, one of the ways we use to describe it is based on the work of Edward Bonilla Silva in terms of colorblind racism and its sort of proxy of gender-blind sexism, in that the prevailing ways in which entrepreneurship gets done are racialized and gendered in ways that make them invisible to those who are practicing these works. So at the end, what we find is that because the phenomenon we're studying, entrepreneurial ecosystems, are neither hierarchies or organizations, but act like trusted networks, which is how people get access to resources through social capital, we find that depending on where you're located in terms of your social category, you may or may not have access to certain information. And depending on that, you may or may not have access to the information and opportunities that are embedded in the ecosystem in itself. One of the other sort of findings that we have in this research is that there seem to be little to none sanctions for violations for breaking the norms of an ecosystem. And we draw on the work that has demonstrated that there are gendered outcomes to behaviors that are stereotypically male. So we sort of give the example of Ellen Pao versus Kleiner Perkins, where she sued them for sexual harassment. And the attorneys on the Kleiner Perkins side argued that she was vengeful, vindictive, and she actually lost her lawsuit. On the flip side, we sort of talk about those masculinized behaviors by Travis Kalanick at Uber, who created an opportunity for sexual harassment to take shape, and he was able to exit the company with about $2.2 billion in severance check and continues to circulate in a very successful way in ecosystems. We bring all these conversations to bear on the fact that entrepreneurship is touted as a tool for economic development globally, not just here in the US. And when we see that the ways in which entrepreneurship takes place, despite claims of inclusion, actually replicate neoliberal inequalities, I think we have something to say in terms of policymakers. So one of the things that we do in terms of the book that we have is we look at the ways in which gender, race, and immigrant status impact the ways in which power, social capital, and social structures influence the individual experiences and the organizational actions of these different actors. So as an example, when we speak to women who are entrepreneurs and who self-identify as of color, they'll often say that they will speak to many, many white male investors who are very interested in supporting them and understanding what their venture is. But when they ask for money, they will say, let me introduce you to this Black investor. So there's often this sort of siloing and moving of individuals across ecosystems to the appropriate sources of investment. So there's a siloing by gender and race. At the same time, we see that a lot of organizations are trying to do better. Although we don't name them in the book, you can probably guess who they are. There are some brand name accelerators and incubators in the Boston ecosystem and nationally that are very much interested in creating inclusive opportunities for entrepreneurship. And in speaking to them, what they will mention is they get thousands of applicants and they have a cohort of 10, and what they do is to take 2 or 3 from the actual pool of applicants, and the 7 to 8 or even 9 will come from referrals of those who are in their trusted networks. So if you're an entrepreneur who doesn't have that network, you literally have very little to no chance of getting in. But if you go to the websites of these firms, you often see that they're touting the diversity of their cohorts and the ways in which inclusion is an important part of who they are as an identity, as a brand. So one of the ways to identify these sort of dichotomies of the espoused values versus the enacted ones is in engaging in conversations. We often find that every single founder that we spoke to, an investor we spoke to, said they valued diversity if they were white and male. But when you looked at their hiring practices, or you asked them about succession planning, or you asked them about their organizational practices, it came back to, we want to hire the best person. We want to grow, and then we'll think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we find is that in the space of entrepreneurship, there really are not a lot of efforts to change the outcomes, even though there's a lot of conversation around how to espouse diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also want to point out that there's also a growing trend of trying to get women investors to invest in more women or women-led startups, which is another way in which diversity, equity, and inclusion is getting done. Unfortunately, there's research that demonstrates from 2020 that firms with female founders who receive funding from female rather than male venture capitalists are 2 times less likely to raise additional funding because there's a stigma associated with getting money from women. And sadly, the research shows that there's actually no equivalent for male-backed firms, right? So women can invest in women, and then they stigmatize the women-led company, but women investors who invest in male companies, the males actually are not stigmatized. So what this tells us is that diversity equity initiatives that try to create funding pools for women or women-led companies may actually end up not only stigmatizing the women companies, but also the investors themselves in suggesting that they might be biased in who they're investing in. So at the end of the day, we really have to question whether or not initiatives that focus on gender or race are ending up hurting versus supporting entrepreneurs who want to be able to engage in entrepreneurship. Lastly, one of the things that I want to address is that the ways in which we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion matter. Often in entrepreneurship, we'll talk about the lack of access to finance or information. If we continue talking about lack of access, what we're saying is we want you to still stay within the structures that are built, versus saying maybe the conversation should be on control and decision-making over capital, which would fundamentally require us to rethink the structures of entrepreneurship rather than to create access for people who've been marginalized. So for me, in the context of entrepreneurship, DEI is not only about sort of changing the practices, but the language around how we think about the ways in which the structures we're embedded in create certain opportunities for some people and not others. So at the end of the day, intersectionality allows us to see and do certain things, which is one, how the interactions and the outcomes and experiences speak to the complexity of race, gender, immigrant status, and any other sort of category within the context of entrepreneurship, more so than any individual category could itself get us to understand. And that the entrepreneurial behavior norms within ecosystems are explicitly and implicitly gendered and racialized. And the ways in which you surface these, I would say, gendered and racialized assumptions is by asking direct questions that kind of, I would say, expose these assumptions that leaders and investors have. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of you can espouse all the values you want, but if you have these assumptions and you're acting on them, fundamentally, we're not really going to change anything. And lastly, the idea that startup communities, it's a huge craze in the US right now of startup ecosystems, startup craze, and moving to certain cities to fund ventures. We have to understand that communities include people, but they also exclude people. So understanding that within the context of entrepreneurship is really interesting. Lastly, we have to understand for policymakers that when you decide that you're going to build an ecosystem to support entrepreneurship, having DEI policies by themselves are not enough. You have to understand the ways in which the ecosystem as a whole is behaving in terms of the people who are getting funding and those who are not. Differences matter, absolutely, but at the same time, you have to understand that when we talk about inclusion, we have to talk about its shadow, which is inequality, which is what the driver of entrepreneurship has been for a long time in the US. I'll leave you with this. If you're interested in all these, this is the book that I used today to talk about the research that my colleague Susan and I completed in the Boston ecosystem. It's, I would say, a just example of the kind of inclusive and exclusive ways in which cities behave, and ultimately whether or not diversity, equity, and inclusion is sufficient to move us away from the inequalities we see on the rise in the US today.